All right, welcome to our first video on setting up multiplayer in Godot. Now, just as a heads up, this is not an easy task. Multiplayer gaming is very complicated. It's a very challenging programming task, and we're not going to be creating your newest Fortnite or massive multiplayer online game or anything like that. What we're going to do is show you some of the basics, get to dabble so that you can at least play head to head a game of some sort between two different computers. But really, this is a dabble into how multiplayer works, and then you can build on it from there as you see fit. Um, to start off, we're going to do this in 2D just to remove any of the complications of 3D, although the parameters and kind of the setup all works basically the same. But I want to make this as simple as possible to start, and then we'll add things to it as we go. So the reason it's so complicated is because you've got basically one game that's got to work on two different machines, and each machine has to share certain pieces of information and not share other pieces of information. For instance, when I press jump on my keyboard, I want my player to jump and make sure that the other players don't jump. But then I also have to send that information to the other players to say, hey, make my player jump. So it gets pretty tricky, and you'll see that there's a lot of layers here that we have to go through. But let's get it going. Now, Godot has done some really nice things to make this starting process a lot easier. As I said, multiplayer is very complicated, and this used to take quite a while just to get really basic things going. But Godot's done some nice stuff for us. So I'm going to start off with just looking at creating a 2D scene here. And I'm going to just call this my multiplayer environment, multiplayer. I'm going to try for simplicity to keep everything just on the same. We're not going to have a separate kind of start screen lobby type thing and then move between levels. Let's keep it basic, and we'll just try and go for one single level. So I'm going to make a lobby here on my multiplayer, and sorry, there's my multiplayer node is going to be my root node there. And we are going to add to that a script, which I'll come back to a little bit later, but it's already nice to go. And then to that, I'm going to add a couple things. The first thing I'm going to do is add a control node. This is going to be my kind of where I set up and join. So here it is there, you can see in my 2D world. And I'm really gonna, I've got two options when I'm starting off here. Either I can create a game or I can join a game. And so I'm going to add two different buttons here to my control node. So let's add another one here. I'm going to say I want to add a button. And this will be my, I'll call it host button. And I'm going to add another button there. Call this my, let's make sure it's a child of control. I'm going to make that a join button. There we go. And now we can grab a couple of those. There's a button there. There's a button there. I'm not going to worry about making this pretty at the beginning. That's something that'll come later on when you start to get those functionality. This whole element here, I'm going to call this my lobby. So I'm going to kind of have a lobby just overlaid on my level 1. And you'll see why in a little bit. Makes it nice and easy to just hide this and get something working. So let's go for my host button. I'm going to throw some text in here. This will be my host, and my join button. Let's make that join. And at the beginning, we're going to make this just work on our computer. So later on, I will add a little field here where you can, when you want to join, you can type in the name or the address in this case at the beginning, the address of the game that you want to join. Because say in the computer lab, you may have a number of people who are running the same game and you would want to join a particular person. But let's keep it simple right now, and we will just have those two buttons as such. We'll maybe put them a little more in the middle of the screen here. All right. So now that I've got this here, let's get into a couple other things that we're going to need to set up. I'm going to first of all just save this scene. We'll call it sure. We'll just start with multiplayer there. That's going to be my whole thing. I've got a lobby on there later on, and to it I'm going to need to add something to play, because basically what's going to happen is I'm going to hide this and then start playing my game. So to make this easier go down the road, I'm actually going to make my level separately and then bring it in here. That way it'd be easier to, you know, just swap out levels as I may want to progress. So I'm going to make a new scene here. I'm going to make a new 2D scene, and this one I'm just going to call level 1. And level 1 is going to be pretty basic. One's really just going to have a floor on it so that the players can land and be ready. Later on, I could put a bunch of platformers and things like that if I want. But let's just add a static body 2D here. Of course, it says it needs a collision shape as usual, and to it I'm going to add a sprite. Later on, if you wanted to make something more elaborate, you could make a tile map, of course. But we're going right back to the beginning, first time we've ever touched Godot here. I'm just going to call this my floor, and it is just going to get the standard little icon here. To which I'm going to just be silly and stretch it out here. I'm not going for pretty, remember. And of course, now we need to add to that a collision shape 2D. Hopefully it's something you have done for a bit. We've done a few times now. We'll add a rectangle shape, and we'll say, okay, here is my floor where it is solid. Perfect. That's it. And again, if you wanted more platforms or things like that to make an actual level, we could add those now, but or let's do it later, because all I really want to do is look at the functionality of this. So if I save this scene, it'll be saved as level 1. Great. Perfect. And I'm going to close level 1 because I don't really want to do anything with it. And so here's what I'm going to do. And the nice part of this is now I can kind of minimize my lobby. I am going to actually instantiate a child scene, make that little link thing. And I'm going to go put level 1 on my first screen. So I've got this lobby here, and you're actually going to see the level right away. Again, this is to keep things simple as possible. So now that I've got that, basically when I host or join, I want to then hide this and then start my game, and my players should start to appear, because I could have 1, 2, 3, 100, depends on how many people are going to be playing my particular game. So let's get into the coding, which gets to be the more tricky part here. Oh, that's a lie, actually. We need one more thing before we start that. I'm going to need a player, and a player that's going to jump around and do your standard kind of 2D platformer type thing. So let's make that, again, I'm going to make that a separate object or a separate scene. And oh, you know what? I'm going to make, I'm not going to place this new scene. I'm going to make it empty. And here's a brand new feature of Godot 4. I really like it. It's not something I'm going to introduce at the grade 10 level, but if we add a new one, you may remember back in the day we did a kinematic body. which was a moving object. You can see that's gone now. They've eliminated it, and they've replaced it with what's called a character body 2D. You can see there's also a character body 3D there. So I'm going to add a character, specialized 2D physics body for characters moved by script. So you can see very similar to a kinematic body. They've just kind of rebranded a little bit and given you something else that's kind of neat. So I am going to double click that. There's my new character body. And I'm just going to call this player. Great, and to the player, of course, we will add our sprite so we get to see the player. I am also going to just cheatingly use this little Godot head there. There it is there, and to it we're going to add a collision shape, 2D. So far, absolutely everything's exactly the same as before. There we go. Let's make this a little bit collision shape, go around our player. So nothing should be different here. Here's where the magic happens though. When we hit attach a script, we've got what are called templates now. And so previously we would have said the node default or an empty object. It would just give you a blank script here. But what they've given us is a character body basic movement template. So Godot's written the code for you. If you hit create, you can see that we are immediately greeted with a character body 2D with a bunch of code already with a physics process in it. You can see we've got a speed and a jump velocity. They've even got a gravity set in the project settings. And notice if not on floor. So it might not be exactly like we have done in our player movement before, but you'll find that the player basically moves exactly like you would anticipate. And what it's using is it's getting the UI left and UI right and a jump there, a UI accept. So, and they also note here, it says, as good practice, you should replace the UI actions with custom gameplay actions. So you don't have to use the UI right, UI left, or the UI accept. You can put your own jump keys in there and swap that out, but with zero programming whatsoever, I can now just save this scene. I'll save it as player, and just to test it out, not that I want this at the moment, but I'm going to add, cancel, sorry. I'm back on my main screen here. On level 1, I am going to link, and I'm going to put a player there, and you can see there's my player. And if I play my game right away with no programming whatsoever, something that took us at least a day to put together previously, you will notice one thing on the new Godot, it does take a little bit longer, but immediately I can now move around, I can jump, I can tweak things. The jumping I noticed by default is a little bit low, especially if we're using this giant thing. So if we want to go a bit higher, we can also tweak that a little bit, but I really like that nice little quick ready to go. I can start quickly making a game. Under project settings, and I think it tells you this here, physics 2D, you have a default gravity here. Oh, so no, I don't need to change that actually. I can do that in my code there. There is the default gravity. So you can tweak it more gravity, but we also have a jump velocity of, I'm going to go negative 800. It was a constant that they just made for us. And if we play, immediately you've got a player. Now, I don't want this player here at the beginning. I just wanted to show you how nice and quick that is to be able to immediately create something. There we go, got a giant jump there. And now we've got our player ready to go. And what I'm going to want later on is multiple players. And again, as I said, I don't want that instantiated there, so I'm going to delete it. I only want a player to appear when somebody has joined a game. So let's look at that next. in our code for our multiplayer, let's start setting this up. It has given us a bit of the basic stuff, so I'm actually going to get rid of that to start with plain Scratch. Um, Here's where we start off. So as I said, the multiplayer can be a little bit tricky. First of all, we have to understand a little bit about how computers communicate with each other. And they do this through over a network through ports. Think of a port as kind of like a virtual, a doorway into your computer, into or out of your computer. All communication outside of a computer is done through a port, and all information coming in is going through a port. And you can't, it's kind of like a dedicated doorway for certain things. First of all, you can't at the same time have somebody going out of a door and into the same door. That causes confusions and collisions. So you've got information. Usually you want to have some outgoing ports and you want to have some incoming ports. So like one-way doors, if you will. And then you also don't want to have your information going out through a port that's dedicated for, I don't know, say the internet coming in, or your Spotify music coming in, or some kind of signal from a network server. So we try and keep the ports, and in general, the ports from on a Windows machine from 0 to 1023, the first 1024 ports, are reserved ports. So we try not to touch those. Anything over that, you're pretty safe, although there are certain other things that operate on certain ports. But I've randomly chosen a port here. I'm going to say my const port equals, I did 4433, just because I'm pretty sure it's not being used by anything else. So this is the port we're going to use for our game player multiplayer communication. As I said, anything under 1024 is often used by something else. There's a few holes and windows in there. You can have some empty doors that you could use, but better safe than sorry. So that's what we start off with doing. Just I could also later on change this if that happened to be a reserved port or a port being used by something else. The next thing we have to do for our multiplayer is create an object that allows for multiplayer communication. And nicely, this in the old days, this was quite a process to set up. Godot has nicely created a built-in object, like a built-in node, that allows for multiplayer communication and connections. So I'm going to assign that to a variable. I'll call the variable multiplayer peer, because each person, each connection in the multiplayer game is called a peer. And this particular one we call an eNet. And oh, is this supposed to be a node 2D or a node? There we go. eNet multiplayer peer. There we go. I think I made a mistake on my node 2D there. eNet multiplayer peer. You can just double click that. So that is the kind of object, and I'm going to make a new one for me. And this basically handles a lot of communication that you had to code in the past. It just knows how connections are made, when a new person connects to a person, when a person disconnects from, say, a server. So it's doing a lot of the heavy lifting for you. All right, there is our first little setup. This is now our games, believe it or not, are ready to communicate with each other, although there's a lot more work to be done as well. So let's keep going with setting up, say, a server. So I've got two options. Remember, when I'm starting my multiplayer game, I'm either going to be the host, meaning I've created the game and I'm inviting other people to come and join, or I am joining an already started game. So I am going to go to my lobby there and say, basically, when I click the host, when I click that, I need the signal to come back here. So I am going to set up my pressed, and I'm going to connect it back to the multiplayer. There we go. And you've done this before as well. So when I click the host button, it sends a signal to that script, and saying, yep, ready to go. I am going to be the host. So I'm going to make a couple little notes here for myself and for you. In this case, we're going to make sure we start as a server. So remember the object, the communication object I've created, this thing, I've called it a multiplayer peer. So multiplayer, the beginning, most of my communication is going to be done with this. My multiplayer peer, the thing I just created, I would like it to remember or know that I am creating a server. And we have a built-in, this type of object has a built-in method called create server. And it's going to create a server, and the communication, the server needs to know how it's communicating or where communication is coming from, and that is through that port 4433. So I'm just going to pass it port. And I feel like I've typed something incorrectly there. Multiplayer is not declared in this current scope. Multiplayer here dot create server. Let's check out why I'm getting that error here. Huh, not sure why. I just copied and pasted that word back, and it must have been a spelling mistake I couldn't see. So we've now created a server on this object here. And the next couple ones, you're going to have to just kind of do a leap of faith with me here to figure out what we're doing here. So we have again, built-in high-level, what we call a multiplayer API, which is what Godot has set up for us so that we don't have to worry about all the little tiny bits behind the scenes. And I'm regretting my choice of multiplayer peer word here, but let's just go with it. So the built-in multiplayer API is called multiplayer. And I'm going to basically connect it, the object I've just created, into this built-in multiplayer API. So here's how it works. Multiplayer peer equals the multiplayer peer that I've just created. I'm again regretting this. Maybe I'll change these here to peer and here and here. There we go. So that is a little bit less confusing. So the multiplayer is the built-in API. There, it has a multiplayer peer, and we've just assigned it the one I just created. Up the peer here, and the next thing I want to do is basically you're ready to go. You're now set up as a server. So we need to start our game. There's going to be a few more things that we're going to add a little bit later, but for now, I'm going to say Okay, well, I can now, I've hosted my game. That's all I need to do. So I can make the lobby and get rid of that lobby there. And I'm going to make it visible um, equals false. So I'm just going to hide my lobby. And then we're going to create a character for our player. We need to bring one into the room. And because I'm going to do this whenever a person joins the game, they get a new character needs to be created. I'm going to make a function here, add player character. Now that doesn't exist yet, but we'll do that in a second here. So let's add that next. So basically, I'm just going to call this function. The add player character is going to create the new player and do a couple other little things that's going to be important later on. So let's make our new function here. So I can create any kind of function that I want, especially for in-game. Just call this func add player character, just like I would do in Python. And by default, we'll get to this in a second here. We're going to make its ID equal to 1. You'll have to just bear with me for a minute here. This has to do with each person who joins a game or is part of the game needs to have its unique ID, so we can be able to talk about who they are. And the default ID, the server, is always ID number 1. So we're just putting that in as a default for now. We'll see how this pans out later on. And essentially, I want to bring in a new character, and I've already made that player. This is very similar to when we fired bullets or do other things in previous games, or if you're brand new, here's how we make it here. I'm going to make a new variable. I'll call it character. Equals, and I used to do this in a couple lines, but we are now able to do this in a single line. It's kind of nice. I can preload the player scene. So that was bringing that in. Previously, I did that as its own line, and then we can instantiate the player. So basically, that means just create one in the room. Now, the character dot name is going to be equal to that ID that I just made, or that got built in as ID1 here as the default. So we're actually going to name the player based on this unique identifier that the multiplayer's world sets up. And then I am going to add child, because just because I create that node doesn't mean it's anywhere in my game. I'm going to add it, and it will become a child of the multiplayer at the moment. We could change that a little bit later should we need to. So let's try and see if that actually works to just create when we host our game. So I am going to hit play. And make sure that I've got everything set up properly, because then we can start talking about joining a game. So if I hit host, boom, there we go. And I get a player, and it's ready to go. That lobby was hidden, and we are good so far. All right, now that takes care of the hosting idea. The issue now is, what about if I want to join a game that's already there? So I'm going to click that join button, and I am going to put a pressed signal and link that back up to the multiplayer script. So now I've got that guy, and I'm just to keep myself organized, I'm going to actually put that down there and bring the join button up. There we go. So when we've joined, it's a little bit trickier. There's a couple other things we need to add here. First of all, let's get rid of that. First of all, when we join, I'm going to start as a client rather than a thing. I want to, and we'll put this a little bit later, but I need to know which computer I'm joining. So establish, so let's do a hashtag here, establish, set up the server we are joining. And at the beginning here, so I'm going to make a var server IP. When we join, we need to join a particular computer, and every computer on our network is set up by what's called its IP address. At the moment, this is only going to work kind of like a LAN party, a locally hosted game. If you want to go out over the internet, you may have to do a couple things with your router because it's not really set up for that. And there's some trickiness that can be involved. So right now we're going to assume that we know the IP of the server, and we can set that up a little bit later. But also at the beginning, we're only going to be playing on our own computer just to test things out. Later on, we can play with anybody else in the room. But if you want your own computers, you could go and get the IP address, but every computer is also identified by its own, which we call localhost. The localhost is the address of the computer that we are on right now. It's also known as 127.0.0.1. That's another one we can use here, but I think fine, localhost makes a little more sense to people. I'm basically connecting to myself. So that is the setup for this. And when I click this, just like I did with, now I didn't have to create the server, so that line is done, but I do also need to, create a client, or I need to join, and that requires a little bit more. So I'm going to say, oh, this peer dot create. Now instead of server, we create a client. Oops, client. And this takes two pieces of information. First of all, it needs to know the port as well that it's going to go through, but then it also needs to know where it's going to go to, the address of that. And so that is the server IP that I just did before. And we are going to go through the same port. That is fine as well because it's a different computer. We're going to communicate back and forth between that on the same one. So there is that line taken care of. Now, same kind of idea. I need to connect this up to the built-in multiplayer API. So I say multiplayer.multiplayer peer. I'm a new peer. Equals the peer that I just created. And we can also now say lobby dot visible equals false. There we go. So we've established that connection. Now you'll notice there's one more thing that we haven't done here, which is I didn't make a player for my client, the person who joined. And that's because what we want is all games to look the same. All games need to be appearing the same, and that gets really, really confusing if we are on multiple different computers. So if I create my player, I need to then send a note to the server where the player is and how it's moving and all that sort of stuff. And the server would need to say, okay, now I've got all of these other players and here's where they are. So it gets, the sharing of information gets a little bit confusing and a little bit overwhelming. So essentially what we try and do is get one computer to be responsible for taking care of all the creation of objects and things like that, and then we share that information with everybody else. So by default, we let the server take care of all of this stuff. And fortunately, as I mentioned, this multiplayer object, this multiplayer API, does a lot of the heavy lifting for us. So I am going to let the server take care of creating new objects. So I go back up to my host button here, and I'm going to pop it right here. And I'm going to say, multiplayer sorry, this is going to be my peer dot peer connected. So notice that when I did it there, you can see it tells us that there is a signal automatically built into this multiplayer API that Godot has given to us. So when a new user, when a new peer connects to a server, it sends out a signal, says, oops, somebody's here is new. You can also see there's another one here when somebody drops off the network and says, oh, I've quit the game. It sends out a signal to say that the peer has been disconnected. So what I'm going to do is when this happens, when the peer is peer connected, when somebody new connects to it, dot connect, and you're going to have to just kind of do a leap of faith here for me and believe this, how this is going to work. When we connect, I'm going to connect up a new function. The function is going to take an ID, as we did before, and it's going to be the ID of a player. And I am going to, in this case, add player character, and I'm going to pass it that same ID. So just do a leap of faith here with this line of code that that's going to work and do what we want. So when somebody connects, I am also going to create another player, and it's going to magically pop into existence. It's going to call that same function, and it's going to create it. Now, you may see a problem here, or maybe you don't quite see it yet because it is kind of layered, but let's see what happens. When we play our game now, we should have a ability to join and to host. And I'm going to add one more thing here just so we can see this now. Under debug, this is a very cool feature here for helping us out. We can go run multiple instances. So this is great for multiplayer games. It allows us to run 2 copies of the same game every time we hit run, so that we can actually have 2 running and we can see the multiplayer setup. So I'm going to run multiple instances. I'm going to run, instead of 1, I'm going to run 2. And we can go 3 or 4 if we need to test things out. But let's give this a try. So I'm going to play now, and what you'll see kind of nicely in a second is that we get 2 windows. But they should behave exactly as if they were on 2 completely different computers. So you can see here I've got 2 copies of my game. Here's my host, here's my join. So when I click host, oh, there I am over there. I'm not sure why I was so far off to the side. I have now created the host game, and that's exactly what happened before. And when I hit join, let's see what happens here. Oh, you can see that on the server, we now have 2 copies of that player. Okay, that's going to run into problems. So, but it actually communicated from one computer to another computer, or at least from one version of the game to another version of the game.